On a cool evening in late September 1994, the small city of Chico, California was settling into the rhythm of a Thursday night. The kind of evening where streetlights flickered on just as the sun disappeared behind the Sierra Nevada foothills in the distance. Where college students from Chico State wandered downtown in clusters, and families finished dinner while the television hummed in the background. It was the kind of night that felt unremarkable in every way, the kind that should have passed without anyone remembering the date. But September 29, 1994 would become a date this community could never forget. 26-year-old Michael Brennan had spent that Thursday the way he'd spent most days since moving to Chico 3 years earlier, working his shift at the campus bookstore, making plans with friends for the weekend, thinking about his future. Mike, as everyone called him, was the kind of person who made an impression without trying. Tall and lean with an easy smile, he had a way of making people feel heard. He'd grown up in Sacramento, the middle child in a close family, and had drifted north to Chico after college, drawn by the slower pace and the sense that here, he might figure out what came next. He'd rented a small one-bedroom apartment on the east side of town, in a complex where most of the residents were either students or young professionals like himself. His neighbors knew him as quiet but friendly, the kind of guy who'd help you carry groceries or lend you jumper cables without making a big deal of it. His sister would later say that Mike had always been that way, steady, dependable, the person you called when something went wrong because you knew he wouldn't judge you for it. That Thursday evening, Mike had planned to stay in. His roommate from college, a guy named Travis, had called earlier in the week to say he might drive up from Sacramento, but the plans had fallen through. So Mike had stopped at the grocery store on his way home from work, picked up something for dinner, and driven back to his apartment as the sun started to dip below the horizon. What happened next would remain a mystery for 16 years. Before we continue with this shocking story, take a second to hit subscribe. We want to know how far these stories reach. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from. This channel brings you true crime stories from small American communities, the cases that don't always make national headlines but leave scars that never fully heal. These are the stories of real people, real families, and real investigations that stretched across decades. When Mike didn't show up for his shift at the bookstore the next morning, his manager assumed he was sick. Mike was reliable, but everyone had off days. She called his apartment and left a message. By the afternoon, when he still hadn't called back, she started to worry. Mike wasn't the type to skip work without calling. She tried again. No answer. It was Mike's older brother, David, who first sensed that something was truly wrong. David lived in Sacramento, about 90 miles south, and he and Mike spoke on the phone at least once a week. They'd made plans to talk that Friday evening, and when Mike didn't pick up, David waited an hour and tried again. Then again. By 9 o'clock that night, David had left 4 messages, his voice shifting from casual to concerned to something closer to panic. Saturday morning, David got in his car and drove to Chico. He arrived at Mike's apartment complex just after noon. The parking lot was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels wrong on a weekend. Mike's car, a faded blue Honda Civic, was parked in its usual spot. David knocked on the apartment door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, and called Mike's name. Still nothing. That's when David noticed that the door wasn't fully closed. The frame was splintered near the lock, as if someone had forced it open. David's hand was shaking as he pushed the door the rest of the way. Inside, the apartment was dim. The blinds were drawn, and the air smelled stale, like the windows hadn't been opened in days. David called out again, his voice tight. He moved through the small living room, past the couch where Mike's jacket was draped over the armrest, and into the hallway that led to the bedroom. And that's where he found his brother. Mike was lying on the floor beside his bed, his body partially covered by a blanket. There was blood, on the carpet, on the walls, on Mike's clothing. David would later tell police that he couldn't process what he was seeing at first. That his brain refused to accept that the person on the floor was Mike. He stumbled backward, found the phone in the kitchen, and called 911. The Chico Police Department arrived within minutes. Officers secured the scene and called for detectives. By early afternoon, the apartment complex was swarming with law enforcement, patrol cars blocking the entrance, crime scene tape cordoning off the building, neighbors standing in clusters on the lawn, whispering to each other and trying to piece together what had happened. The initial investigation painted a grim picture. Mike had been stabbed multiple times in what appeared to be a violent struggle. The medical examiner would later determine that he'd been dead for at least 36 hours, meaning he'd likely been killed late Thursday night or in the early hours of Friday morning. The apartment showed signs of forced entry, but nothing appeared to have been stolen. Mike's wallet was still on the kitchen counter, his car keys on the coffee table. His television, his stereo, everything of value was still there. To the detectives, this immediately suggested that robbery wasn't the motive. This was something personal. The lead detective on the case was a man named Tom Callahan, a 15-year veteran of the department who'd worked everything from domestic disputes to drug investigations. Callahan was methodical, known for his ability to remain calm even in the most chaotic crime scenes. But even he was unsettled by what he saw in Mike's apartment. The level of violence, the number of stab wounds, the disarray in the bedroom, suggested rage. Whoever had done this hadn't just wanted Mike dead. They'd wanted him to suffer. Callahan and his team began interviewing everyone they could find. Mike's neighbors, his co-workers, his friends. They asked the same questions over and over. Did Mike have any enemies? Was he involved in anything dangerous? Had anyone threatened him? And every time, the answer was the same. No. Mike Brennan was quiet, friendly, and well-liked. He didn't owe anyone money. He didn't have a temper. He wasn't involved in drugs or crime. He was just a regular guy trying to make a life in a small town. One neighbor, an older woman named Carol, told detectives that she'd heard something Thursday night, raised voices, maybe, coming from Mike's apartment. But she hadn't thought much of it at the time. She'd assumed it was just the television or someone talking on the phone. She hadn't heard anything that sounded like a fight. She hadn't heard screams. Looking back, she said, she wished she'd paid more attention. But how were you supposed to know when something ordinary was actually a warning? Another neighbor, a college student named Eric, said he'd seen someone leaving the apartment complex late Thursday night. He couldn't say for sure what time it was, maybe 11, maybe closer to midnight. He'd been coming home from a party and wasn't paying much attention. But he remembered seeing a figure walking quickly toward the parking lot, head down, hands in their pockets. He couldn't describe the person beyond that. Male, maybe. Average height. Wearing dark clothing. It wasn't much to go on, but it was something. For the Brennan family, the days that followed were a blur of grief and disbelief. Mike's parents, Richard and Susan, drove up from Sacramento the day his body was discovered. They stayed in a hotel near the police station, waiting for updates, trying to make sense of something that had no sense to it. Susan would later say that she kept expecting Mike to walk through the door, to tell them it had all been some terrible mistake. That it couldn't be him. Not her Mike. David, meanwhile, blamed himself. He replayed that Friday night over and over in his mind, the unanswered phone calls, the growing sense that something was wrong. He kept thinking that if he'd just driven up sooner, if he'd checked on Mike Thursday night instead of waiting until Saturday, maybe things would have been different. Maybe Mike would still be alive. But Detective Callahan knew better than to let families torture themselves with what-ifs. The truth was, by the time David arrived in Chico, Mike had already been gone for more than a day. There was nothing anyone could have done. In the weeks that followed, the investigation moved forward with the kind of quiet intensity that defines small-town police work. Detectives interviewed more than 50 people, friends, co-workers, acquaintances, even people who'd only met Mike once or twice. They pulled phone records, searched for patterns, looked for anyone who might have had a reason to want Mike dead. They found nothing. The crime scene itself yielded frustratingly little physical evidence. There were no fingerprints on the door or the murder weapon, a kitchen knife that had been left at the scene. No footprints. No DNA that could be immediately tested with the technology available in 1994. The killer had either been extremely careful or extremely lucky. One theory that emerged early on was that Mike might have known his attacker. The forced entry suggested someone had broken in, but the level of violence suggested a personal connection. Callahan and his team began looking at people in Mike's life more closely. Had he recently ended a relationship? Had he argued with anyone at work? Was there someone who might have felt slighted or betrayed by him? But again, the answers led nowhere. Mike had dated a woman named Jennifer for about 6 months earlier that year, but they'd broken up amicably and she'd since moved to Oregon for a new job. She had an alibi, she'd been at work the night Mike was killed, and her co-workers confirmed it. There were no angry ex-girlfriends, no jealous rivals, no disgruntled friends. Mike's life, by all accounts, had been simple and drama-free. As fall turned to winter, the case began to stall. Callahan kept the file on his desk, kept following up on tips as they came in, but the trail was growing cold. The community, meanwhile, was still reeling. Chico was a town of about 60,000 people, large enough to have a university and a downtown but small enough that violent crime felt like an aberration. People knew each other here. They left their doors unlocked. They trusted their neighbors. Mike's murder shattered that sense of safety. Suddenly, people were checking their locks twice before bed. Parents were walking their college-aged kids to their cars. The idea that someone could break into an apartment in the middle of the night and kill a young man for no apparent reason, it was the kind of fear that settled in and refused to leave. The Brennan family, desperate for answers, did everything they could to keep Mike's case in the public eye. They organized vigils, printed flyers, offered a reward for information. Susan appeared on local news stations, her face drawn with grief, pleading with anyone who might know something to come forward. She talked about Mike, the son she'd raised, the brother who'd made his siblings laugh, the young man who'd had his whole life ahead of him. She begged the person responsible to turn themselves in, to let their family have some kind of peace. But as the months turned into a year, then 2 years, the tips stopped coming. The news moved on to other stories. The vigils grew smaller. Mike's case became just another file in the Chico Police Department's Unsolved Homicide Division, a name on a list that seemed to grow longer every year. Detective Callahan never forgot about Mike. Even as he moved on to other cases, he kept Mike's file close. He'd pull it out every few months, read through the witness statements, look at the crime scene photos, hoping that something would click. He'd call David Brennan occasionally, just to let the family know that the case was still open, that they hadn't given up. But the truth was, without new evidence or a witness willing to come forward, there wasn't much more he could do. To the town, Mike Brennan's murder became a story people told in hushed tones. The young man who'd been killed in his own apartment. The case that had never been solved. Over time, it took on an almost mythic quality, the kind of tragedy that people referenced when they wanted to remind each other that terrible things could happen anywhere, even here. But for Mike's family, it was never a story. It was a wound that refused to heal. By the early 2000s, the case had been cold for nearly a decade. Callahan had retired, and the file had been passed to a younger detective named Maria Ortiz. Ortiz was thorough and determined, but she faced the same obstacles Callahan had. The evidence was thin. The witnesses had moved on. The trail, if there had ever been one, was impossibly cold. What no one realized at the time was that the answer had been there all along. Hidden in plain sight. Waiting for someone to ask the right question. To understand how the case was eventually solved, you have to understand how small towns work. How information moves. How secrets are kept. In a place like Chico, everyone knows everyone, or at least knows someone who knows someone. People talk. They gossip. They remember. And sometimes, they protect each other. In 1994, one of Mike's neighbors had been a man named Jason Pritchard. Jason was 24 at the time, a year or two younger than Mike, and he lived in the same apartment complex. He worked at a local auto repair shop, kept to himself, and had a girlfriend named Amy who lived in another part of town. To most people, Jason was just another face in the complex, someone you might nod to in the parking lot but wouldn't think twice about. But Jason had noticed Mike. He'd seen him around, observed the way people gravitated toward him. The way Mike seemed to move through life with an ease that Jason had never felt. Jason was the kind of person who carried resentment like a stone in his pocket, small grievances that accumulated over time, building into something heavier. In the weeks before Mike's death, something had happened between them. It was minor, an argument over a parking space, a comment that Jason had taken the wrong way. Mike probably didn't even remember it. But Jason did. He held on to it, let it fester. And on the night of September 29, 1994, that resentment boiled over. No one knew this at the time, of course. Jason had been questioned along with every other resident of the complex, and he'd told detectives that he didn't know Mike well, that he'd been home alone the night of the murder, asleep by 11. He said he hadn't heard anything unusual. Hadn't seen anything. And because there was no physical evidence tying him to the crime, no witnesses who could place him at Mike's door, the detectives had moved on. Jason, meanwhile, went back to his life. He kept working at the auto shop. He stayed with Amy, eventually marrying her in 1997. They had a daughter a few years later, bought a small house on the west side of town, and settled into the rhythms of middle-class life. To anyone who knew them, they were an ordinary family. Jason was quiet, maybe a little withdrawn, but that wasn't unusual for someone who worked long hours. Amy thought her husband was just tired. Stressed. She never suspected that he was carrying a secret that weighed more than anything she could imagine. For years, Jason kept that secret buried. He didn't talk about Mike Brennan. He didn't follow the news coverage. He did everything he could to pretend that night had never happened. But secrets have a way of demanding attention. They don't disappear just because you refuse to look at them. By the late 2000s, Jason's marriage was unraveling. He and Amy fought constantly, about money, about his drinking, about the way he seemed to drift further and further away from her and their daughter. Amy would later tell friends that Jason had always been moody, but in those years, it got worse. He'd have nightmares, wake up in the middle of the night drenched in sweat. He'd drink until he passed out on the couch. He'd disappear for hours without explanation. Amy didn't know what was wrong, but she knew something was. She'd ask him about it, try to get him to talk, but Jason would shut down. He'd say he was fine. That she was imagining things. That she needed to stop pushing him. But Amy wasn't imagining things. And eventually, Jason's walls began to crack. In the spring of 2009, Jason and Amy separated. Amy took their daughter and moved in with her parents, and Jason stayed in the house they bought together, alone for the first time in more than a decade. Without Amy there to anchor him, Jason spiraled. He stopped going to work. He spent his days drinking and his nights staring at the walls, replaying everything that had happened since that night in 1994. One evening in July 2009, Jason called an old friend, a guy he'd known since high school named Greg. Greg hadn't spoken to Jason in a few years, and when he picked up the phone, he could immediately tell that something was wrong. Jason was drunk, his words slurred and rambling. He talked about how everything in his life had fallen apart. How he'd lost his wife, his daughter, his job. How he didn't see the point anymore. And then, without warning, Jason said something that made Greg's blood run cold. He said, "I did something once. A long time ago. Something I can't take back." Greg asked him what he meant. Jason didn't answer directly. He kept talking in circles, saying he couldn't live with it anymore, that it was eating him alive. Greg tried to get more out of him, but Jason suddenly seemed to realize what he was saying. He changed the subject, made an excuse, and hung up. Greg didn't sleep that night. He kept replaying the conversation in his head, trying to make sense of what Jason had said. He thought about calling the police, but he wasn't sure what he'd even tell them. That his friend had made a vague comment while drunk? That didn't prove anything. But the next morning, Greg started thinking about Mike Brennan. He'd been living in Chico in 1994. He remembered the murder, everyone did. He remembered that it had never been solved. And he remembered that Jason had lived in the same complex as the victim. Greg didn't want to believe that his friend could have done something like that. But the more he thought about it, the more the pieces seemed to fit. Jason's drinking. His nightmares. The way he'd always been so closed off, so unwilling to talk about the past. It took Greg 2 weeks to make the decision. And when he finally picked up the phone and called the Chico Police Department, his hands were shaking. Detective Maria Ortiz took Greg's call. She listened as he explained what Jason had said, how it had made him think of Mike Brennan. Greg was careful to emphasize that he didn't have proof, that Jason hadn't explicitly confessed to anything. But he wanted someone to know. He couldn't live with the possibility that he'd stayed silent about something so important. Ortiz thanked Greg for calling and promised to look into it. After she hung up, she pulled Mike Brennan's case file from the archives and started reading. Jason Pritchard. She found his name in the witness statements from 1994. He'd lived in the same complex. He'd been questioned and cleared. There'd been no reason to suspect him at the time. But now, 15 years later, there was. Ortiz began digging into Jason's life. She pulled his employment records, his financial history, his criminal record, which was clean except for a DUI in 2005. She found Amy, Jason's estranged wife, and arranged to meet with her. Amy was nervous when Ortiz first contacted her. She didn't understand why a detective wanted to talk to her. But when Ortiz mentioned Mike Brennan, Amy's face went pale. Amy told Ortiz that she'd never known Jason in 1994, they hadn't met until a few years later. But she said that over the years, Jason had sometimes talked in his sleep. He'd say things that didn't make sense. Names. Fragments of sentences. One name in particular had stuck with her, Mike. She'd asked Jason about it once, years ago, and he'd brushed it off. Said it was just a dream. But Amy had never forgotten the way he'd looked when she asked, the flash of panic in his eyes, the way he'd shut down and refused to talk about it. Ortiz asked Amy if Jason had ever been violent. Amy hesitated before answering. She said that Jason had never hit her, but that he could be intimidating when he was angry. That there were times when she'd been afraid of him, even if she couldn't exactly explain why. It wasn't much. But it was enough for Ortiz to keep digging. Over the next several months, Ortiz built her case slowly and carefully. She re-interviewed some of the original witnesses from 1994, including Eric, the neighbor who'd seen someone leaving the complex the night Mike was killed. Eric's memory was hazy after so many years, but when Ortiz showed him a photo of Jason from 1994, he said it was possible. The build was right. The height. He couldn't be certain, but he didn't rule it out. Ortiz also reached out to the district attorney's office to discuss the possibility of reopening the case. The DA was cautious. 15 years was a long time. The physical evidence was minimal. They didn't have DNA linking Jason to the scene. They didn't have a weapon with his fingerprints. What they had was circumstantial, a drunken confession to a friend, a wife who'd heard him talk in his sleep, a neighbor who couldn't rule him out. But Ortiz believed it was enough to at least bring Jason in for questioning. On a cold morning in February 2010, Ortiz and two other detectives drove to Jason's house. It was early, just after 6 a.m., and the street was still dark. Jason answered the door in a t-shirt and sweatpants, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. He looked at the detectives with a mixture of confusion and dread. Ortiz introduced herself and asked if Jason would be willing to come to the station to answer some questions. She didn't say what it was about, but Jason seemed to know. He nodded, asked if he could get dressed first, and returned a few minutes later wearing jeans and a jacket. The drive to the station was silent. Jason sat in the back seat, staring out the window, his jaw clenched. At the station, Ortiz and her partner sat across from Jason in a small, windowless interrogation room. They started with easy questions: where Jason was living now, what he'd been doing for work, how things were going with his family. Jason answered in short, clipped sentences. He didn't ask why he was there. He didn't demand a lawyer. He just sat there, his hands folded on the table, waiting. And then Ortiz said the name, Mike Brennan. Jason's reaction was immediate. His face went rigid. His hands tightened into fists. For a long moment, he said nothing. And then, quietly, he asked, "What about him?" Ortiz explained that they were revisiting some old cases, looking at evidence with fresh eyes. She said they'd been talking to people who knew Mike, people who lived in the complex back in 1994. She asked Jason if he remembered anything from that time, anything that might help them. Jason shook his head. He said he didn't remember much. That it was a long time ago. Ortiz leaned forward. She told Jason that she knew he'd been struggling. That she knew his life had been hard the past few years. She said that sometimes, carrying guilt for that long could break a person down, and that if there was something he wanted to talk about, now was the time. Jason looked at her, his eyes red-rimmed and exhausted. And then, in a voice so quiet the detectives almost couldn't hear him, he said, "I didn't mean for it to happen. If you believe people like Jason Pritchard should be held accountable for what they've done, no matter how long it takes, hit the subscribe button. These stories matter because justice does." Over the next several hours, Jason Pritchard told detectives what had happened on the night of September 29, 1994. He said that he and Mike had had an argument a few weeks earlier, something stupid, something Jason couldn't even fully remember. But it had stuck with him, gnawed at him. He'd started paying attention to Mike, noticing when he came and went, listening to the way other people in the complex talked about him. It made Jason feel small. Insignificant. On that Thursday night, Jason had been drinking. He'd been sitting in his apartment, stewing in his own anger and frustration, when he decided to confront Mike. He didn't have a plan. He didn't bring a weapon. He just wanted to tell Mike off, to make him understand how he'd made Jason feel. Jason said he knocked on Mike's door around 10:30. Mike answered, confused but polite. He asked Jason what was wrong. And that politeness, that calm, reasonable tone, only made Jason angrier. The argument escalated quickly. Jason pushed his way into the apartment. Mike told him to leave. Jason refused. And then, in a moment that Jason said he could barely remember, he saw the knife on the kitchen counter. He picked it up. Mike tried to back away, tried to calm Jason down. But Jason couldn't stop. He said it was like watching himself from outside his body, like he wasn't in control of his own hands. When it was over, Mike was on the floor, bleeding, and Jason was standing there, still holding the knife. He said he panicked. He wiped the knife down, threw it on the floor, and left the apartment as quickly as he could. He walked back to his own apartment, washed his hands, and sat on his couch in the dark, trying to convince himself that it hadn't really happened. But of course, it had. Jason's confession was devastating, not just because of what he'd done, but because of how senseless it had been. Mike Brennan hadn't wronged him. There'd been no betrayal, no deep conflict. Just a moment of anger, fueled by alcohol and resentment, that had spiraled into something irreversible. Ortiz and her partner listened without interrupting. When Jason finished, he put his head in his hands and started to cry. He said he'd wanted to turn himself in 100 times over the years. That he'd thought about it almost every day. But he'd been too afraid. Afraid of what would happen to him. Afraid of what people would think. Afraid that admitting it out loud would make it too real. But now, sitting in that interrogation room, he said he was tired of running from it. Jason Pritchard was arrested and charged with the murder of Michael Brennan. The news spread through Chico like wildfire. People who'd known Jason, his co-workers, his neighbors, even some of his friends, couldn't believe it. He'd lived among them for 16 years, gone to work, raised a daughter, and never once given any indication that he'd killed someone. Amy, Jason's estranged wife, was devastated. She told friends that she felt like she'd been living with a stranger, that she'd never really known the man she'd married. She worried about their daughter, about how to explain to a child that her father had done something so terrible. For the Brennan family, the arrest brought a kind of closure they'd never thought possible. Susan, Mike's mother, said that she'd spent 16 years wondering if they'd ever know what happened to her son. She'd imagined 1,000 different scenarios, some stranger, some random act of violence. She'd never imagined it was someone Mike had barely known, someone who'd killed him over nothing. David, Mike's brother, told reporters that he felt relief, but also a kind of anger that was hard to articulate. Relief that they finally had answers. Anger that it had taken so long. Anger that Jason had lived a life, had a family, a home, a future, while Mike had been buried in the ground for 16 years. The legal proceedings that followed were relatively brief. Jason's confession had been recorded, and his attorney advised him that fighting the charges would be futile. In late 2010, Jason Pritchard pled guilty to second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 15 years to life in state prison. At his sentencing hearing, Jason was given the opportunity to speak. He stood before the judge, his hands shaking, and apologized to the Brennan family. He said there were no words that could undo what he'd done, no explanation that could make it right. He said he understood if they hated him, and that he hated himself. Susan Brennan sat in the courtroom, listening. She didn't cry. She didn't yell. When Jason finished speaking, she simply looked at him and said, "You took my son. You took everything." The judge, a woman named Catherine Miles, handed down the sentence without hesitation. She told Jason that his actions had not only destroyed Mike's life but had shattered a family and traumatized a community. She said that while his confession had been an act of some courage, it didn't erase the fact that he'd spent 16 years living freely while the Brennans had lived in anguish. Jason was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. He didn't look back. In the months and years that followed, the people of Chico slowly came to terms with what had happened. For 16 years, they'd wondered who had killed Mike Brennan. They'd speculated, imagined, feared. And in the end, the answer had been someone unremarkable. Someone who'd lived among them, invisible and ordinary. Detective Maria Ortiz was praised for her work on the case, but she was quick to deflect credit. She said that the real heroes were people like Greg, Jason's friend, who'd had the courage to come forward even when it meant implicating someone he'd known for years. She said that cold cases were solved not just by good police work but by ordinary people deciding to do the right thing, even when it was hard. Greg himself struggled with the role he'd played. He told a local reporter that he'd lost sleep over the decision to call the police, that he'd questioned whether he was betraying a friendship. But in the end, he said, he knew that staying silent would have been worse. That Mike Brennan's family deserved the truth, and that justice mattered more than loyalty to someone who'd done something so wrong. Amy Pritchard, meanwhile, tried to rebuild her life. She filed for divorce from Jason, changed her last name, and focused on raising her daughter as far from the shadow of the case as possible. She rarely spoke publicly about what had happened, but in one interview, she said that she'd spent years wondering if there were signs she'd missed, clues that her husband was capable of violence. In the end, she decided that some secrets are kept so deeply that no amount of vigilance could uncover them. For the Brennan family, the resolution of Mike's case was bittersweet. They finally had answers, but those answers couldn't bring Mike back. They couldn't undo 16 years of grief, of wondering, of living with an open wound. Susan Brennan said that she'd imagined the moment they caught Mike's killer 1,000 times. She'd thought it would bring her peace, that it would allow her to finally move on. But the truth was more complicated. Justice had arrived, but it had arrived so late. Mike had still been robbed of his life. She'd still been robbed of her son. David, Mike's brother, channeled his grief into advocacy. He began volunteering with a nonprofit that supported families of unsolved homicide victims, helping them navigate the frustration and uncertainty that came with waiting for justice. He said that what had kept his family going was the knowledge that someone out there was still fighting for Mike, still refusing to let his case be forgotten. He wanted to be that person for other families. Richard, Mike's father, was quieter in his grief. He attended Jason's sentencing but rarely spoke about the case afterward. Friends said that he seemed to age years in the months following the arrest, as if the weight of finally knowing had exhausted him in a way the not knowing never had. The story of Mike Brennan's murder and Jason Pritchard's eventual confession became a cautionary tale in Chico, a reminder that violence doesn't always come from strangers, and that the people who hurt us are often the ones we least expect. It was also a reminder that justice, while slow, is not impossible. In the years since Jason's conviction, the case has been studied by law enforcement agencies as an example of how persistence, community cooperation, and a willingness to revisit old assumptions can crack even the coldest of cases. Detective Ortiz's work was featured in a training seminar for homicide investigators, where she emphasized the importance of never discounting circumstantial evidence and never giving up on victims, no matter how much time had passed. But for those who knew Mike, the case will always be more than a training example. It will always be a reminder of a life cut short, of a family forever changed, and of a community that learned the hard way that safety is never guaranteed. Mike Brennan's grave is in a quiet cemetery on the outskirts of Sacramento, not far from where he grew up. His headstone is simple, just his name, his dates, and a line that reads, "Loved and remembered." Susan visits regularly, even now, more than a decade after Jason Pritchard was convicted. She brings flowers, sits beside the grave, and talks to Mike the way she used to when he was alive. She tells him about his nieces and nephews, about the way the world has changed, about the things he would have loved and the things he would have hated. She tells him that they never stopped looking for justice. That they never stopped fighting for him. And in her heart, she believes he knows. The resolution of Mike Brennan's case stands as a testament to the idea that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can still find its way to the surface. It took 16 years, but in the end, the lies that Jason Pritchard told himself, that he could move on, that the past would stay in the past, collapsed under their own weight. Justice in this case didn't come from advanced forensics or dramatic courtroom battles. It came from the slow accumulation of pressure. A friend who couldn't ignore what he'd heard. A detective who refused to let an old case stay buried. A wife who finally saw the cracks in her husband's carefully constructed facade. It came from the simple, stubborn belief that what happened to Mike Brennan mattered. That his life had value. That he deserved more than to be forgotten. And in a world where so many cases go unsolved, where so many families never get answers, that belief made all the difference. But even with Jason behind bars, even with the truth finally known, there's a question that lingers. Could this have been prevented? Could someone have seen the warning signs in Jason Pritchard before that night in 1994? Could a friend, a coworker, a neighbor have noticed the simmering resentment, the way small grievances seemed to consume him? Or was this one of those tragedies that no amount of vigilance could have stopped, a perfect storm of anger, alcohol, and opportunity that came together in a single, devastating moment? Detective Ortiz thought about this often in the years after Jason's conviction. She'd spent countless hours reading through his history, trying to understand how an ordinary person could commit such an extraordinary act of violence. And what she found was both troubling and strangely mundane. Jason Pritchard wasn't a monster. He wasn't a serial killer or a violent criminal. He was just a man who'd let his worst impulses control him for one terrible night. And that, in some ways, was more frightening than any alternative. Because it meant that the capacity for violence existed not in some distant other, but in people who seemed completely normal. In neighbors. In co-workers. In the person standing in line at the grocery store. Ortiz came to believe that what happened to Mike wasn't inevitable. That if Jason had made different choices that night, if he'd stayed in his apartment, if he'd gone to bed instead of drinking, if he'd talked to someone about his anger instead of letting it fester, Mike would still be alive. But she also believed that trying to predict which person would snap, which grievance would escalate, which night would turn deadly, was nearly impossible. All you could do, she thought, was refuse to look away when something felt wrong. Refuse to stay silent when someone confessed to something terrible, even if they were your friend. Refuse to let cases go cold just because time had passed. That was the lesson she took from Mike Brennan's case. Not that violence could always be prevented, but that justice could always be pursued. The impact of Mike's murder rippled outward in ways that took years to fully understand. His friends, the ones he'd made in Chico, the ones who'd known him in Sacramento, carried the weight of his death differently. Some threw themselves into their careers, as if working hard enough could somehow make sense of the senselessness. Others struggled with anxiety and depression, unable to shake the feeling that if something so random could happen to Mike, it could happen to anyone. One of Mike's closest friends from college, a man named Brian, started a nonprofit in Mike's name that provided support to families of homicide victims in Northern California. Brian had been devastated by Mike's death, and for years, he'd felt helpless in the face of it. Creating the nonprofit gave him a way to channel that grief into something constructive, something that honored Mike's memory by helping others who were going through what the Brennan family had endured. The organization started small, just Brian and a few volunteers working out of a borrowed office space. But over the years, it grew. They provided counseling services, helped families navigate the criminal justice system, and advocated for legislative changes that would give victims' families more rights and more resources. They held annual memorial events where families could come together, share their stories, and support one another. Brian would later say that the nonprofit was his way of keeping Mike alive. Not in a literal sense, but in the impact he'd had on the world. Mike had been the kind of person who made others feel seen, who listened when people needed to talk, who showed up when it mattered. The nonprofit tried to embody those same values. To be there for people when everything else felt like it was falling apart. In the community of Chico itself, Mike's case became a reference point, a before and after. People who'd lived there in 1994 remembered where they were when they heard about the murder. They remembered the fear that had settled over the town, the way people had started looking at their neighbors differently, wondering if anyone was really who they seemed to be. And then, 16 years later, they remembered the shock of Jason Pritchard's arrest. The disbelief that it had been someone so ordinary, someone who'd been there all along. Some people said it made them feel vindicated, that their instinct that the killer had been local, someone close, had been right. Others said it made them feel even more unsettled, because it meant the danger had never really left. It had just been hiding in plain sight. The apartment complex where Mike had lived was demolished in 2005, replaced by a small shopping center. But people who'd lived there still remembered. They remembered the yellow crime scene tape, the news vans, the way the parking lot had felt haunted for months afterward. Some of them had moved away, unable to shake the association between that place and what had happened there. Others had stayed, but they never forgot. There's a small memorial plaque now, installed by the city in 2011, near where Mike's apartment once stood. It's modest, just a bronze plate embedded in the sidewalk, with Mike's name and the dates of his birth and death. It doesn't explain what happened. It doesn't tell his story. It just acknowledges that he existed, that he mattered, that he shouldn't be forgotten. Susan Brennan attended the dedication ceremony. She stood beside the plaque, her hands clasped in front of her, and thanked the city for remembering her son. She said that for 16 years, Mike's death had felt like something that had been swept under the rug, something the community wanted to move past. But this plaque was a statement that he still mattered. That what happened to him still mattered. She knelt down, placed her hand on the bronze, and whispered something no one else could hear. The question of why Jason Pritchard finally confessed has been debated by criminologists and psychologists in the years since. Some believe that guilt simply became too heavy to carry, that after 16 years of living with what he'd done, Jason had reached a breaking point. Others point to his deteriorating life circumstances, his failing marriage, his drinking, his isolation, and suggest that the confession was less about conscience and more about self-destruction, a way of forcing the consequences he'd been avoiding. Dr. Helena Reeves, a forensic psychologist who studied the case, offered a more nuanced view. She said that people who commit violent crimes often construct elaborate psychological defenses to protect themselves from the full weight of what they've done. They compartmentalize. They rationalize. They tell themselves stories that allow them to keep functioning. But those defenses require constant maintenance. They require a stable life, routines, relationships that keep you anchored. When Jason's life fell apart, when his marriage ended, when he lost his job, when he found himself alone, those defenses started to crumble. The story he'd been telling himself about who he was could no longer hold up against the reality of what he'd done. Dr. Reeves believed that Jason's drunken confession to his friend Greg wasn't a momentary lapse. It was the first crack in a dam that had been straining for years. And once that crack appeared, it was only a matter of time before the whole thing gave way. She also noted that Jason's confession, while ultimately the right thing to do, didn't erase the harm he'd caused. It didn't undo 16 years of the Brennan family's suffering. It didn't bring Mike back. What it did was transfer the weight of the secret from Jason to the criminal justice system, from silence to acknowledgement. And that, Dr. Reeves said, was significant. Because acknowledgement was the first step toward justice. For Greg, the friend who'd made the call to the police, the aftermath was complicated. He'd done what he believed was right, but it had cost him. He lost other friends who felt he'd betrayed Jason. He struggled with guilt, wondering if there was something he could have done years earlier, some way he could have intervened before Jason's confession. In an interview with a local journalist in 2012, Greg said that he'd thought long and hard about whether to come forward. He said that loyalty to a friend was important, but that loyalty had limits. That it couldn't extend to protecting someone who'd taken another person's life. He said that he thought about Mike Brennan's family often. About the years they'd spent not knowing. About the pain they'd carried. And he knew that if he'd stayed silent, that pain would have continued indefinitely. I couldn't live with that, Greg said. I couldn't be the person who had the answer and didn't give it to them. The journalist asked if he regretted making the call. Greg shook his head. No, he said. I regret that I had to make it. I regret that my friend did something that forced me to choose. But I don't regret the choice itself. The legal system's handling of Jason Pritchard's case also raised questions about justice and accountability. Jason had pled guilty and been sentenced to 15 years to life, but some people felt that wasn't enough. They pointed out that Mike Brennan had been 26 when he died. That he'd lost 50, 60, maybe 70 years of life. That 15 years, even with the possibility of never being paroled, seemed like a poor exchange. Others argued that Jason's confession and cooperation should be taken into account. That without his admission, the case might never have been solved. That the closure he'd provided to the Brennan family had value, even if it couldn't undo the harm. The district attorney who prosecuted the case, a man named Robert Chen, said that the sentence reflected the reality of what they could prove. Without physical evidence tying Jason to the scene, without witnesses who could definitively place him in Mike's apartment, the case had relied heavily on Jason's own words. A plea deal had been the surest path to conviction. Chen also noted that the passage of time had complicated things. Evidence had been lost. Witnesses' memories had faded. If they'd tried to take the case to trial, there was a real possibility that a jury would have acquitted Jason, not because he was innocent, but because the prosecution couldn't meet the burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. So they'd taken the deal. And Jason had pled guilty. And the Brennan family had finally gotten their answer. Was it perfect justice? No. But in a system built on imperfect evidence and human testimony, it was as close as they were going to get. As the years passed, Jason Pritchard became eligible for parole hearings. The first one was held in 2025, 15 years after his conviction. Susan and David Brennan both attended, prepared to give victim impact statements and to argue against his release. Susan spoke first. She told the parole board about Mike, about the son she'd raised, the young man he'd become, the future he'd been robbed of. She talked about the 16 years her family had spent wondering what had happened, the toll that not knowing had taken on all of them. She said that while she believed Jason had shown remorse, she didn't believe 15 years was enough time for the life he'd taken. David spoke next. He was more direct, more angry. He said that Jason had gotten to live half of his adult life as a free man after killing Mike. That he'd gotten married, had a child, built a career, all things Mike would never have the chance to do. He said that letting Jason out now would send a message that some lives mattered more than others, that if you could hide your crime long enough, the punishment would be lighter. The parole board denied Jason's release. They said that while he'd expressed remorse and had been a model prisoner, the severity of the crime and the length of time he'd evaded justice warranted continued incarceration. He would be eligible for another hearing in 3 years. Outside the building, Susan told reporters that she felt relieved but exhausted. That these hearings would continue for the rest of her life, probably. That every few years, she'd have to relive Mike's death, argue for why his killer should stay behind bars, and hope that the board agreed with her. "This is what justice looks like for us," she said. "It's not a one-time thing. It's something we have to keep fighting for." The story of Mike Brennan's murder and the eventual arrest of Jason Pritchard is, in many ways, a story about time. About the way 16 years can feel like both an eternity and an instant. About how grief doesn't follow a timeline, how it stretches and contracts, ebbs and flows, but never fully disappears. It's a story about secrets and the cost of keeping them. About how guilt can transform a person, slowly and quietly, until they barely recognize themselves. About how the truth, once buried, doesn't stay buried forever, it waits, patient and inevitable, for the moment when it can finally surface. And it's a story about persistence. About detectives who refuse to let cases go cold. About friends who make hard choices. About families who refuse to let their loved ones be forgotten. Mike Brennan was 26 years old when he died. He'd been living in Chico for 3 years, working at a bookstore, figuring out what came next. He was someone's son, someone's brother, someone's friend. He had a future that should have included decades more of life, of experiences, of moments both ordinary and extraordinary. Jason Pritchard took that future away in a single night of rage and recklessness. And for 16 years, he lived with that secret, carried it like a stone he couldn't put down. Until finally, the weight of it broke him. The resolution of this case didn't bring Mike back. It didn't erase the pain his family had endured. But it did something important. it affirmed that his life had mattered. That what happened to him wasn't something that could just be forgotten or swept aside. That justice, even when delayed, was still worth pursuing. In the years since Jason's conviction, the Brennan family has found ways to move forward, though they'll never fully move on. Susan still visits Mike's grave regularly. David continues his work with victims' families. Richard, Mike's father, passed away in 2018, but before he died, he told Susan that he was grateful they'd lived long enough to see Jason arrested. That it meant Mike hadn't been forgotten. The family has created a scholarship in Mike's name at Sacramento State University, where Mike attended college. It's awarded annually to a student studying literature, Mike's passion, and comes with a small plaque that tells his story. Not the story of how he died, but the story of how he lived. The books he loved. The way he made people laugh. The kindness he showed to everyone he met. The scholarship is modest, but it ensures that Mike's name will continue to be spoken, that his impact will extend beyond his death. Every year, a student will receive an award in his honor, and for a moment, they'll learn about a young man from Sacramento who loved books and died too young. It's a small act of resistance against forgetting. A way of insisting that Mike's life was more than the circumstances of his death. The case has also had a lasting impact on law enforcement in Chico and beyond. Detective Maria Ortiz went on to work several other cold cases, using the lessons she'd learned from Mike's investigation. She became a vocal advocate for keeping unsolved cases active, for periodically reviewing old evidence, and for never dismissing tips just because they come years after a crime. In training sessions with other detectives, Ortiz emphasizes the importance of listening to people when they come forward, even if what they're saying seems minor or uncertain. She points to Greg's phone call as an example. He didn't have concrete evidence. He didn't witness the crime. He just had a feeling, a suspicion based on a drunken confession. But that was enough to reopen the case. That was enough to lead to justice. Cold cases don't solve themselves, Ortiz tells younger detectives. They solve because someone cares enough to keep looking. Someone refuses to let the victim be forgotten. Someone decides that the truth matters more than convenience. She also emphasizes the role of the community. We can't solve these cases alone, she says. We need people to come forward. We need them to trust us with information that might feel incomplete or uncertain. We need them to believe that what they know matters. The story of Mike Brennan has been told and retold in various forms over the years. Local newspapers ran anniversary pieces on the 10th and 20th anniversaries of his death. True crime podcasts have covered the case, examining the psychological profile of Jason Pritchard and the investigative techniques that led to his arrest. Law enforcement journals have published articles analyzing what worked in this case and what lessons could be applied to other cold cases. But for those who knew Mike, these retellings are bittersweet. On one hand, they ensure that he's remembered, that his story reaches people who never knew him. On the other hand, they reduce a complex, vibrant person to a victim, a name attached to a tragedy. Brian, Mike's friend who started the nonprofit, has spoken about this tension. He said that he wants people to know Mike's story, but he also wants them to know Mike. To understand that he was more than the circumstances of his death. That he had dreams and fears and quirks. That he laughed too loud at bad jokes and stayed up too late reading novels. That he was thoughtful and sometimes too hard on himself. That he was human. When we only tell the story of how someone died, Brian said, we erase who they were when they were alive. And that's another kind of loss. There's a tendency, in true crime, to focus on the moment of violence, the investigation, the arrest. To move quickly past the years of grief and uncertainty, the way families rebuild their lives around an absence. But those years matter. They're where the real story lives. For the Brennan family, the 16 years between Mike's death and Jason's arrest were years of holding their breath, waiting for news that might never come. They were years of wondering if the person who killed Mike was someone they passed on the street, someone who smiled at them in the grocery store, someone who lived in the same town and went about their life as if nothing had happened. And in a way, that's exactly what Jason Pritchard did. He lived in Chico. He worked. He married. He had a daughter. He attended barbecues and birthday parties. He was, by all outward appearances, a normal person. But beneath that normalcy was a secret that poisoned everything it touched. A secret that turned Jason into someone he barely recognized. A secret that ensured he could never be fully present in his own life, because part of him was always back in that apartment in 1994, always reliving the moment when everything changed. That's the hidden cost of violence. It doesn't just destroy the victim. It hollows out the perpetrator, leaving them with a life they can never fully inhabit. If we step back and look at the broader implications of this case, several things become clear. First, that time doesn't erase crime. No matter how many years pass, the truth remains. It may be buried, obscured, forgotten by some, but it's still there, waiting. And justice, while it may be delayed, is not impossible. Second, that ordinary people play a crucial role in solving crimes. Greg, Jason's friend, didn't have forensic training. He wasn't a detective. He was just someone who heard something troubling and decided to act on it. That decision, difficult as it was, made all the difference. Third, that communities bear the weight of unsolved crimes in ways that aren't always visible. The fear, the suspicion, the loss of trust, these things linger long after the initial shock fades. When a case is finally solved, it doesn't just provide closure to the victim's family. It allows an entire community to exhale, to move forward from a tragedy that had been frozen in time. And finally, that justice is complicated. It doesn't always look the way we expect. It doesn't always feel satisfying. But it still matters. The Brennan family didn't get Mike back. They didn't get to undo the 16 years of not knowing. But they got the truth. They got accountability. They got to hear Jason Pritchard say, in a court of law, that he was responsible for their son's death. That's not nothing. In a world where so many families never get answers, where so many killers are never caught, where so many cases remain unsolved, the fact that Mike's case was resolved, even after 16 years, is significant. There's a photograph of Mike that his family likes to share. It was taken a few months before he died, at a family gathering in Sacramento. Mike is sitting on his parents' back porch, a book in his lap, laughing at something someone off camera has said. The sunlight catches his face just right, and for a moment, he looks completely at peace. Susan says that's how she tries to remember him. Not as the young man whose life was cut short, but as the son who loved books and made people laugh. As Mike, in all his complexity and humanity. He was more than what happened to him, she says. He was more than the worst thing someone else did. And I want people to know that. It's a simple wish, but a powerful one. In a world that often reduces victims to their deaths, insisting on their humanity, their wholeness, is an act of love and resistance. The case of Mike Brennan is now closed. Jason Pritchard is serving his sentence. The investigation that spanned 16 years has been concluded. The evidence has been filed away. The witnesses have moved on with their lives. But the impact of what happened in that apartment in Chico in September 1994 continues to ripple outward. It continues in the scholarship that bears Mike's name. In the nonprofit his friend created. In the memorial plaque on a Chico sidewalk. In the stories his family tells about who he was. It continues in the lessons learned by detectives who studied the case. In the courage of a friend who made a difficult phone call. In the persistence of an investigator who refused to let an old case stay buried. And it continues in the simple, stubborn truth that Mike Brennan's life mattered. That he deserved justice. And that justice, no matter how long it took to arrive, was worth fighting for. In the end, this is a story about many things. About violence and its consequences. About guilt and confession. About persistence and courage. But more than anything, it's a story about remembering. Remembering that every victim was once a living person with hopes and dreams and fears. Remembering that justice delayed is painful, but justice denied is worse. Remembering that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of surfacing when people refuse to look away. Mike Brennan was 26 years old when Jason Pritchard took his life. He should have had decades ahead of him. He should have grown old, had experiences, made memories. Instead, he was reduced to a name on a case file, a cold case that seemed destined to remain unsolved. But his family refused to let him be forgotten. Detectives refused to let his case gather dust. And when the moment came, When Jason's walls finally crumbled and the truth came spilling out, the justice system was there to receive it. That's the hope at the heart of every cold case. That someday, somehow, the truth will emerge. That the victims will be remembered. That accountability will arrive, even if it takes years or decades. For the Brennan family, that hope was realized in 2010, when Jason Pritchard was arrested and charged with Mike's murder. It wasn't the ending they would have chosen. But it was an ending. It was truth. It was justice. And for a family that had spent 16 years in limbo, that meant everything. Rest in peace, Mike Brennan. You were loved. You are remembered. And you will never be forgotten. These stories exist because there are people who refuse to look away from hard truths. People who understand that every cold case represents a life that mattered, a family that deserves answers, and a community that needs healing. The cases that fill the archives of police departments across this country aren't just files. They're not just statistics. They're people like Mike, ordinary people living ordinary lives until one terrible moment changed everything. If you stayed with this story until the end, you're someone who understands why these cases matter. You're someone who believes that time shouldn't erase accountability, that justice is worth pursuing even when the trail has gone cold, and that victims deserve to be more than footnotes in history. The people who stay for stories like this are exactly the ones this channel exists for. You already understand that truth has weight. That remembering matters. That the work of seeking justice doesn't end just because years have passed. This case was solved because ordinary people made extraordinary choices. Greg made a phone call he didn't want to make. Detective Ortiz pursued a lead that others might have dismissed. The Brennan family refused to let Mike's death become just another unsolved mystery. In towns and cities across America, there are families still waiting for that call. Still hoping that someone will come forward. Still believing that their loved one's case can be solved. Those families need people like you, people who pay attention, who care about justice, who understand that every story deserves to be heard. This work continues because people like you keep these stories alive. Because you refuse to let victims become statistics. Because you believe, as Susan Brennan believed for 16 long years, that the truth will eventually surface if enough people refuse to stop looking for it. Thank you for bearing witness to Mike's story. Thank you for remembering him not just as a victim, but as a person who lived, who mattered, who was loved. I'll see you in the next one.